Hello and welcome back to the podcast on North American literature, hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. My name is Juanma, the host of this podcast, and today we have Bea Soler, a student of North American literature. So she's going to share with us some information about her research. So Bea, tell us a bit about it.
Well, as Juanma has already said, this is Bea Soler. I'm an English philology student and I'm here to talk about our research regarding individuality and self-exploration. I contrasted two poems in this research from two famous figures of American literature that are Walt Whitman and Anne Sexton. And I wanted to say that I'm really glad to be here in your podcast and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you to you for coming. For those people who are not familiarized with these authors, can you introduce them to our audience?
Of course. Let's start with Walt Whitman, as he's the author that gave sense to the whole research. He was born in 1819 in New York and grew up in a large working class family. And I said large because his mother gave birth to 9 kids.
Wow, 9 kids. Here in Spain, it was a common thing to have plenty of children, true, but imagine how hard would it be to feed those kids.
Not just the feeding part, but imagine having 9 kids screaming or fighting with one another.
Oh, no, thank you.
I'm glad that changed and that we have ways to avoid it. But going back to his life, his early years were kind of unremarkable, as he worked as a printer, a teacher, a school teacher, and later as a journalist. But what's really fascinating is how Whitman emerged as this larger-than-life figure. He was self-taught, incredibly curious, and deeply empathetic. His writing reflects that sense of wonder and unity he felt with the world around him.
Oh, yes. I read that he learned it from the places he visits thanks to his work, right?
That was so important for his development because he was exposed to events that he wouldn't be able to go to if he didn't have that job. He learned a lot from the reviews and all the things he did.
Oh, Leaf of Grass, right? It was his magnum opus. It was his life work, isn't it?
Exactly. He first published it in 1855, and it wasn't really well received initially because the language and the themes were considered scandalous. This was a guy writing about the body, the soul, democracy, and even sexuality in a way that no one did before. Maybe because men were not used to being this deep when talking about the things he did. But he kept revising and expanding it throughout his life, and by the time he died in 1892, it had grown into a groundbreaking collection.
So he wasn't immediately celebrated as this poetic genius.
Not at all. Whitman was kind of controversial because Leaves of Grass was too explicit for this period. But over time, people like Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, recognized his genius. He even wrote a famous letter in 1855 calling Leaves of Grass, and I will quote it, the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. And later on, he says in the letter, I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start.
Oh, wow, that's high praise. And I guess that after reading the letter, Whitman was motivated enough to focus, on giving Leaf of Grass the recognition it deserved. right? So first, let's zoom out for a second. So, what was the world like when Whitman was writing?
Well, the mid 19th century was a kind of transformative time in America. Like, you got the Industrial Revolution, the westward expansion, and the later Civil War. And Whitman was deeply affected, I have to say, by all of this because, as I previously told you, he was so empathetic. He saw America as this chaotic, changing democracy place, and he believed poetry could help bring people together. In a hostile place, he wanted people to be unified in some way.
Mm, well, I always get this sense from his poetry that he was writing not just for his time, but for the future. So that he wants a society working together to make future better.
Absolutely. He was so optimistic about humanity, even in the face of war and division, because during the Civil War, he even volunteered as a nurse, caring for the wounded soldiers, and that experience shaped some of his later work.
Mhm.
For example, especially in poems like The Wound Dresser, which shows a more cruel part of war rather than giving an heroic sense to it.
Wow. So you say that his optimism wasn't naive. So it was hard-hearted.
Exactly. He had this belief that the interconnectedness of all people, and that's what makes his work feel so timeless. Like, we will get the sense later when we go deeper in the poem.
Okay, alright. So let's shift gears to Anne Sexton then. So she couldn't be more different from Whitman in terms of style and themes. So could you tell us about her life?
Definitely. Anne Sexton was born in 1928 in Massachusetts, and her life was marked by incredibly highs and devastating lows because she struggled with mental health issues throughout her life. And writing poetry was actually suggested by her therapist as a form of therapy for her.
Oh, wow, it's fascinating how poetry helped her in some way.
It really did. But sadly, she is also an example of how important mental health is, as she committed suicide in 1974.
Oh, well, luckily, we are more aware of the importance of mental health, for sure. And we still have a lot of work to do with it, but things have improved since the 70s. So, let me ask you this: how were her first years as a writer?
Well, she started writing in her 30s and quickly gained recognition. Like, her first book, called To Beldan and Part Way Back, was published in the 60s and established her as one of the pioneers of confessional poetry. And the book won immediate attention because it has like a personal nature.
Oh, confessional poetry. So, for those who don't know, um, confessional poetry is an intimate and vulnerable style that focuses on extreme moments of individual experience, personal traumas, and mind.
Exactly. Sexton wrote about topics that were considered kind of taboo at that time, which is also part of confessional poetry. Like, we have mental illness, motherhood, sexuality, and even death. And her poems mm, give the impression to be shocking, but they are also incredibly beautiful.
Um, I read that she wasn't formally trained in poetry. Is that true?
Yes, but she was a quick study. Like, she joined writing groups in Boston that led her to friendships with some of the best poets. of her time, like Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath. Sexton's natural talent combined with her willingness to bet her soul made her a big figure in poetry.
Oh, how interesting. Um, let's talk about the role of Sexton when she was writing in. Um, what was the social context for her work?
Well, Sexton was writing in the mid 20th century, which is a time of significant cultural shifts. She lived in the post Second World War era. Era. She was the period was marked with traditional gender roles, but the 60s and 70s saw the rise of the second wave feminism. And Sexton's poetry often explored the pressures and the contradictions of being a woman at that era, in that era.
So you telling me that her work was really ahead of its times in terms of gender and identity?
Definitely, she didn't hesitate in addressing the struggles of women, from domesticity to darker aspects of mental health. But she also faced criticism for being too personal or too confessional.
Mm, it's interesting how both Whitman and Sexton faced pushback and pushing boundaries in her writing.
Absolutely, they were both unafraid to confront the truth of their times, even when it made people uncomfortable.
Yeah, it seems to be a hard situation, having society turning its back to you.
Exactly. Imagine being a gay person in a society that doesn't accept it. Like, it is hard enough for people, LGBT plus people, to express themselves nowadays. And I think our society is way better than it was in Whitman and Sexton's period. And in this poem, we will see in Whitman's poem that he does not say explicit things related to sexuality, but it gives the sense that he is in fact referring to homosexuality and so.
Wow, being a woman during the 20th century seems like a hard job to do as well. So
Yeah,
I suppose woman had to play the role of being the perfect wife and do whatever they are asked, right?
hmm
So I am glad that it changed as well. Um, now that we have well explained the context of both of them, why did you choose these two authors?
Well, this context will help a lot to understand better the main points of my research. Like, my research involves two poems: The Prairie, Grass Dividing by Whitman, and In Celebration of My Uterus by Sexton. I contrasted them in order to see if Whitman influenced Sexton in a way when writing her poem, as they were from groups of people that were not valued in society. There were some similarities that I wanted to highlight and contrast to see.
Well, I noticed that you mentioned the use of pronouns, right?
Yes, right at the beginning of the research, because the use of pronouns in both texts were one of the things to highlight. For example, they both use the pronoun I, which is at first seems to be referring to one single person. I mean, it could be the poetic voice, the one that is in the poem. But now that we have the context, I argued that they might be referring not only to one single individual but to a whole group of people.
So you mean people that share a common situation?
Exactly. In the case of Sexton, we have a society that has women as an inferior gender, and in Whitman's society, it may refer to sexual freedom for men or American people demanding equality and democracy. And in the case of Sexton, the reading is like obvious. We have one point and we focus on it, women. But for Whitman, you decide if you want to give it like a queer reading or a more political one or both.
Oh, yeah. Um, So, taking into account Whitman's background, both written are accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they use structures involving free verse and parallelism. Is there any reason for this?
That's a very good point. It is true that they both use free bears, which can be related to the volition to be free from something that stops them from being who they really are. And regarding parallelism, which is, for those who don't know, the repetition of structures throughout a poem, in this case, in Sexton's poem, we have in lines 3 to 6, they wanted to cut you, but they will not. They said you were immeasurably empty, but you're not. Negating what they, meaning men or society in general, say. And in Whitman, we find demand the most copious and close companionship of men. Demand the blades to rise of words, acts, beings. Lines 3 to 4. It is like a more active way to demand the things you want, and he also makes the remarks the importance of individuality, as we have demand the blades. He's separating a whole carpet of grass to individual blades.
So, I noticed that in both poems there are natural elements to build meaning in the actual poems. So, even the name leaf of grass, it cannot be more connected to nature. And in Sexton's, on the other hand, I noticed that she uses the beating of a bird's wings in her poem. So these two uses, we could say, of nature are quite different, aren't they?
Yeah, in Whitman's poem, we have the notion of nature connected to spirituality, connectedness between individuals, and intimacy, with the use of words related to the five senses like odor with smell, sweet with taste. And if you want to smell or taste something, you have to be really close to it, which helps with this intimacy between men, because this text is about men. And when you read, I wanted to ask, when you read sweet, what comes to your mind?
The things that comes to mind are, for example, touching, of course, and because taste is related to the mouth. Could it be that it is, in a way, meaning kissing?
Exactly. It gave the idea of intimacy, the non-explicit sexuality of the poem that we mentioned before. But we also have words like erect in the 6th line that gives a more explicit idea of it. But the use of this explicitness is not that common in this poem.
Oh, wow, that's brilliant.
It really is. And in the case of Sexton, the beating of the bird's wings makes a powerful image with the movement of the wings and so. And what kind of bird did you imagine when you read it for the first time? Was it a small one?
Oh, definitely not. Sorry. The one that I imagined, it was a quite big one, a strong one, like a powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah, this power can also be related to sensuality. Like we have women, like they were seen like machines to produce children, and now we get a powerful, sensual, and relevant image of them.
So, then you think Whitman influenced Sexton when she wrote "In Celebration on My Uterus"?
At first, I thought that there were some things in common that made me doubt, but after investigating about it, I came to the conclusion that there was no influence at all. They were both people from groups that were suffering in a way because of society, but and they were both remarking the importance of individual self-exploration and community. but those similarities are like a coincidence more than influence from one to another.
Wow, but it was so interesting to see this contrast, even if there was no influence at all. I'm sorry to say this, but we're running out of time. Even though we would love to have more time to dive deeper into your research for sure.
I completely understand. And before we leave, I want to thank you so much for having me because it's been such a great opportunity to share a bit of what I've been working on.
Oh, we're so glad that you could share your work with us, and it was an absolutely fascinating, and I think our audience will enjoy it as well. So thank you and goodbye.